Over the last lectures, we learned how to write basic tests. I'll show you some other tests, no worries, but how can you actually write tests on your own? How do you know that there is a find method on the wrapper? How do you know what the it method does in detail if I wouldn't have told you? Well, the official documentation helps you with that. And for testing, I can only recommend looking into the official docs, as well as, if you really want to dive deeper into testing, as well as checking out some dedicated resources, some dedicated courses or tutorial articles, I mean with that. Let's have a look at the documentations. Here, I'm on the jest documentation, and you can simply find that by Googling for jest. There you'll find a getting started guide, and always keep in mind, jest is not bound to React or create React app. It's a JavaScript test runner. You can use it in any JavaScript project. So on this page, you'll find some general ideas about how it works and how you configure it. And then the API reference is especially useful if you click on the expect method. There you'll learn how to actually use the expect method and which functions to chain to it. Like toHaveLength, which we already used here. You'll find a detailed instruction and examples. And a similar documentation is available for all the utility methods here. So that's a great way to find that function you need to test your code. You'll also find more about how to mock certain things. Mock means replace. That's especially useful when working with some async code where you don't want to execute that actual code. You don't want to reach out to the web. You want to mock this. You want to step in and replace that function with a function that just returns some demo data you could work with. Because you're always not testing a service, but you're testing what your code does with the returned data. So that's the jest documentation. Now there's a similar one for enzyme. Here you will also find installations about how to install it with different React versions. Then the general guide on how to use it with various test runners in case you don't want to use jest, and the API reference. There you find the shallow rendering I already showed you and two alternatives. You can always dive into it. Full rendering is useful if you want to render the complete component tree. That should rarely be the case, but you might have some circumstances where you want to test some cross-component dependency. Always see if you can solve it with a unit test first though. Now we used shallow rendering thus far, so let's click into shallow rendering. And there on the left side you find all the helper methods you have. We for example use the find method. If you click on it, you'll always find examples and explanation, and there you see exactly what we used. A wrapper which renders something with shallow, and then find to look into it. And here the toHaveLength looks different because they assume a different validation library, not jest. But that of course is the part which depends on your validation library. The part on the wrapper is what's connected to enzyme. So this is the documentation, and as I already said, I can only encourage you to look into it. So with that, let's look into it. And let's check the contains method. Because I want to write one other test before we leave our navigation items component. There, we already test for a lot of things regarding the navigation items. Now I want to test something very specific. If we have a look at that file, we notice that there is a logout component, which is only there if we are authenticated. Which makes sense, it should only be there if we are authenticated. So I want to check if that specific navigation item is there. And for that, I can use this contains helper. Because the contains helper, unlike find, does not take an element type or a CSS selector to be precise. There, as you can see for find, you could also use class selectors. But contains takes a real node, and you can therefore check if you have an exact match. So let's write one more test. I'll copy my wrapper from before, because I again want to test if we're authenticated. Now I'll get rid of my previous code. And now, here, I want to use the contains method on my wrapper component. Now in there, I want to check for the existence of one specific node. Now since we don't use a selector, I'll use JSX code again for my navigation item. And the navigation item I'm looking for is actually not a self-closing one, but one which has an opening and closing selector, because in between there'll be a logout text. And the navigation item will have a prop link which leads to /logout. So I'm basically writing exactly the same code as in my navigation item component here. And with that, I'm checking if that is really part of the wrapper. Now here I could write to have length 1 to see if only 1 is there, or to mix it up, I can check if this is to equal true. So I want to find it if we are authenticated. Now with that, let's save this. And we get a failed test here. Do you know why the third test failed? Because I deleted wrapper set props. And I did this on purpose. I wanted to show you that each test runs independent of the others, because we call before each. So we render the wrapper anew before every test. So if this test also assumes authentication, then we have to repeat wrapper set props in there. Now with that, the test succeeds. So now we see two things. Each test runs independent of the other, and the key point of this lecture, we can use a different method from enzyme to test for different things combined with a new method from jest. And now it's of course also up to you to play around with the different methods and write clever tests. Some hints regarding this in the next lecture.